I'm really delighted again to be joined by the brilliant Gideon Levy, who has been one of the most important voices throughout this horror. Moral clarity, as I always talk about, is essential when we're talking about this. And Gideon always his contributions, moral clarity in spades. Gideon, how you doing?
Thank you, Owen. Thank you for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Always a huge pleasure. So much has happened since we last spoke.
Yeah.
I'm just quite interested in terms of, firstly, just in terms of the dynamics within Israeli society as regards a war which has gone on now since, if we call it a war, it's probably not really an accurate description, but since, well, we're getting on for 9 months. And I'm just interested because Israel's official war aims haven't been met at all. Hamas has not been destroyed. The hostages have overwhelmingly not been returned by military force. Far more have likely been killed just by area bombing than have been rescued. And obviously the big exchanges happened through a ceasefire deal and a prisoner exchange. I'm just trying to interested in how much that's cut through in Israeli society, that general sense of what was promised at the beginning and now we're 9 months in, that those official war aims have failed pretty badly, I would say, on their own terms.
The Israeli mindset is still very, very limited and very limited to certain points of view. And all the rest don't interest most of Israelis. Namely, they see this war as a failure, no doubt about it. But it is a failure only because it did not achieve the Israeli goals. And above all, Israel failed in releasing the hostages. But this war is not only about the hostages, but it's quite amazing how 9 months of killing and destruction in Gaza didn't change anything in Israel's mindset about the price that Gaza is paying. I would expect that in a certain stage, in the beginning, it was all about taking revenge. Really, blood was really boiling here, as we say. After the 7th of October, people looked for revenge, looked for punishment, looked for aggression because they felt beaten, humiliated, and also mourning. And this was maybe understandable. But after 9 months, nothing changed. In former wars, there was some kind of dynamic, always in the beginning supporting anything Israel is doing. And then gradually you get the critics about what are we doing and what for are we doing it. And above all, aren't there any limits? This time we still are in the same place. Netanyahu must go, the hostages must be released, and that's our only problems in this war.
In terms of the human costs, there's been a discussion here, and I've seen some say, well, actually, people in Israel aren't seeing the human cost. It's not, being presented on the news. I guess my worry always about that kind of argument is that everyone has internet connections. I mean, even here, the vast majority of the horrors in Gaza aren't being shown on mainstream TV channels. You just see them on social media. I'm just wondering, how much is there just in terms of, we're talking potentially 14,000 children minimum have been killed. Even notwithstanding that immediate aftermath after 7th October and that kind of mentality. I mean, we're so far in, and there's been just some of the great atrocities, I would say the 21st century. Has any of that cut through at all? I mean, how much has there never, within Israeli society of look at this, whatever's happened to us, look at this horror. I mean, has that not changed at all?
I wish I could give you another answer, but the answer is still nothing penetrates the Israeli conscience. I say it with not only pain, but I'm even surprised. Me who is really suffering for years of Israel apathy and Israel dehumanizing the Palestinians and ignoring their suffer for decades. And still I can tell you what is happening this time shocks me in the level of blindness and the level of not wanting to know, and above all, this level of justifying everything. Every atrocity, every crime that the Israeli army is committing in Gaza will immediately be justified by, I would say, 95% of the Israelis. Immediately, automatic. You don't even ask what, why. It will be justified. To release 4 hostages and to kill 200 Palestinians, totally justified. And would it be 1,000 Palestinians? It would have been also justified. To get into some neighborhoods to look for bodies of Israeli hostages, and by the way, to kill tens and maybe hundreds of Palestinians, justified. 15,000 children, justified. No doubt, no cracks in this position. And you really think what happened here this time, which is still different, because in the former wars, there were more voices who really felt some kind of human feelings also toward the Palestinians. Here, Israel is still on the 7th of October, on the eve of the 7th of October, 7th of October in the evening. We are still there. We still remember only what happened on the 7th.
I mean, on that, that's why, there was an Israeli peace movement. I mean, it was large. It brought huge numbers of people to the streets, including, for example, the war in Lebanon in the 1980s. I mean, there's not even, I mean, they're extremely, there's voices like yourself. There's very courageous Israelis, but they're courageous, I suppose, because they're so marginalized. But there's not even the seeds, as far as I can tell, of even what we had in the 1980s in Israel. The big Peace Now demonstrations.
You can't even compare it. When Israel not committed, but was a partner to the massacre in Sabra and Shatila, a passive partner, no Israeli soldiers participated. There were 400,000 people in the streets only for this, not for nothing else. Not changing the government, no hostages, only for the killing of Palestinian refugees, the slaughtering of them in Sabra and Shatila. People went and protested against the killing, against the crime. Today you will not get 400 for the same crime.
We've heard, just in terms of the broader context, the West Bank, and there's been, I mean, I know this is coming from Smotrich, who's one of the more extreme elements of an extreme government, talking about the potential annexation of the West Bank, and even suggesting that Benjamin Netanyahu approves of that. And it does strike me that actually, when you hear that, it's not just saber rattling. Eventually, the general direction is this: the annexation of the West Bank, in which there are 3 million Palestinians living. I mean, huge numbers of illegal settlements. I think 700,000 Israeli settlers. Do you think that's where partly we've seen huge numbers of people, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed on the West Bank, very little media attention, people driven from their homes. In terms of just the general context at home, and that, I mean, do you think that's plausible? And do you think Israeli society, again, would generally approve of that?
It's not a question, because it is happening. It's not like it is only a plan. While we are speaking, it is happening. And not only the West Bank. Don't underestimate the plans about the Gaza Strip. I don't see that the northern part of the Gaza Strip will remain Palestinian after this war. I will not exclude the possibility of settlement even there. They have their plans. And trust them. They know what they are doing. They are devoted, and the government and all the institutions of the government are supporting them, military, police, everything. And same now, obviously, in the West Bank. Smotrich has a plan, and it was just revealed recently. And don't underestimate his capabilities, because there is, on one hand, total apathy about what's going on in the West Bank. And those who care are only the settlers, and they are ready to do anything, and they are doing anything. I don't know when have you been last time in the West Bank, but I go every week, and from week to week, I see new scenes there. From week to week. It's not something to be happen for the future. It's something that is happening right now, including many, many new outposts. Each outpost means more land which will be confiscated, And finally, it goes toward an annexation, if not the legal one, and de facto one. From my point of view, Owen, the annexation happened a long time ago, by the way. I don't think that anyone can reverse and make the West Bank Palestinian again. I don't see how to make it.
Because, I mean, the whole point of the vision about the disengagement, so-called, from Gaza was to the real jewel in the crown was the West Bank, wasn't it? That was the whole point for the Israeli withdrawal back nearly 2 decades ago. It was to cement the project to essentially annex the West Bank.
I don't know. I think that the main issue was that Sharon realized that Israel cannot hold the Gaza Strip. The price will be too heavy, especially, as you say, if you want to maintain the West Bank. And he decided to sacrifice the Gaza Strip, not for the sake of the Palestinians, by all means not, to sacrifice the Gaza Strip, sacrifice in terms of Israeli interest, in order to guarantee the control of the West Bank. And this is what happened.
You raise that aspect of the annexation of at least large parts of Gaza. And when we say large parts of Gaza, Gaza is a small strip of land. It's the size of East London. 2.2 million people before the war lived there. We have no idea what the horrible clinical term excess death toll is, which takes into account not just those killed by direct violence, but there are thousands of cancer patients in Gaza who haven't been treated. I'm just throwing one example into the mix in terms of how, the general long-term death toll. But do you think, I mean, we just had this, I'll just say it, a catastrophic performance by Joe Biden in the debate against Donald Trump. There's a presidential election now with June, at the beginning of November. It's not long away. Do you think Netanyahu is just waiting out for that US presidential election with a possible Trump victory in which he thinks then he could get away with, for example, annexing large parts of Gaza, driving its people out, maybe Trump doing some sort of deal with the Egyptian dictatorship to get some of them driven out into the Sinai desert? I mean, what do you think? Is there there's a holding pattern until the presidential election and then the full plan in Gaza can be executed?
No doubt that Netanyahu is really counting the days for the elections in the United States because there is a chance that things will be easier for Israel after, even though Trump is unexpected, and I wouldn't count on him on anything. But yes, from this point of view, the plans are very clear. It is a wide zone, security zone, separation zone along the entire Gaza Strip, and the northern part of the Gaza Strip will remain Israeli, Jewish, not Palestinian. That's the plan. By the way, by the time we are talking, they are destroying in southern Lebanon systematically villages and houses in order to have this same security zone also in Lebanon. So it's the same strategy, which, by the way, doesn't guarantee any security, for sure not in times of long-range missiles. What does it mean, 20 kilometers, 10 kilometers? I mean, it's relevant only to certain kind of weapons. I say the bottom line, I don't see Israel leaving Gaza in the coming years. And that's a catastrophe by itself.
But before I ask you about Lebanon, I mean, just in terms of, we discussed, obviously, a peace movement in Israel, which once did exist, non-existent in any meaningful mass form, at least. When we had that rescue operation in which 4 Israeli hostages were rescued, about 300 Palestinians were slaughtered, including many kids in the process. Has that just, because obviously you do have within Israeli society those who will prioritize rescuing the hostages, returning the hostages to their loved ones over wiping Gaza out off the face of the earth. I mean, there is at least that contingent of Israeli society. But has that been marginalized, basically, by that successful hostage deal, which then ironically means less hostages get saved because obviously the vast majority of hostages are only ever going to get released by these prisoner exchange deals. Has that just basically that fact, particularly the families of the hostages, who've often been a moderating force on the Israeli government, has that just they've just been, any prospects of that deal now is just dead?
Yes, but you describe our reality as it is. Most of Israelis don't see reality as it is because it is being presented to them, introduced to them by the Israeli media, who shows an entire different picture. You mentioned the release of the hostages, which I mentioned also before. In Israeli eyes, this was a hell of a success. Israel was in euphoria for 1 or 2 days. It's not that people were happy that 200 or 300 Palestinians were killed. They didn't care about it. It was so marginal that it was hardly mentioned, which in many ways is even worse. It was hardly mentioned. It was only mentioned. They even had the chutzpah to call it a surgeon, a very chirurgic operation, a very precise one. Nothing to do with 300 or 200 people who were killed. I mean, it is not in the discourse at all. It's very hard to describe it to people outside because it's hard to believe that that's the discourse. It's hard to believe. But take my word, the discourse is totally different than you imagine yourself and totally different than it should be or than it is in Europe, in the United States, or elsewhere. And therefore, those questions are not being raised at all.
But because obviously I would expect that obviously the Palestinian life, it's worth being completely ignored and marginalized. I get that. But I suppose what I mean is before there was a sense of, look, if we're going to get our hostages out, we have to do a deal. We don't like it, but that's how you do it. Does the success of getting for those, I mean, obviously no one's talking about the Palestinian mass killings, but basically is there a sense of that's how we get the hostages? We go and we're going to rescue them. We don't need to do a deal. Is that now the consensus?
Not for the families. Most of them are clever enough to understand, and they say it again and again, and they keep on saying it, that only a deal will bring to the release of their beloved ones. The problem is that the hostages are not the political basis of this government. It became a political issue. And therefore, the government can totally ignore their protest. Again and again, I'm being asked, does the protest risk the government? Does it influence the government? Not at all. They can totally ignore it because in any case, that's not their political basis. Almost most of them are not from their political basis. Would it be settlers taken hostages? Believe me, they would have been already released months ago. Months ago. That's not the political basis. Those are kibbutzniks, leftists, or those, I don't know. There were obviously also Likud supporters among so many Israelis, but they are not perceived as rivals as endangering the government, because in any case they wouldn't vote for this government. And as you know, finally, so much is decided in Israel by domestic politics.
I mean, on that, Benjamin Netanyahu, because clearly after the 7th of October, deeply unpopular, blamed for the basic security failures, which obviously led to a mass slaughter. So within Israeli society, there was a broad consensus. It does strike me that he's clawed that back. I mean, there's always been this mistaken narrative indulged here in Europe and the United States that the problem is Netanyahu, and clearly that's not true. He's a very convenient bogeyman. But it strikes me that actually he's outmaneuvered his opponents and he's clawed back support within Israeli society, certainly in a kind of, keep hold of nurse for fear of something worse, perhaps. That's the mentality in Israeli society. Is that true? Is Benjamin Netanyahu essentially outmaneuvered his opponents and consolidated his support in enough of Israeli society that if there were elections there's a very good chance he'd end up being prime minister again.
I couldn't describe it better than you. He is recovering. He didn't make it yet, but no doubt that he went a long way ever since the first weeks after the 7th, in which it was clear that his career is over. Things look different. And he has many explanations, not only one explanation. Don't forget that in front of him, against him, around him, there is no one. The alternatives are so weak. And by the way, not very different from him when it comes to core issues. There is not a real alternative to Netanyahu. Yes, the others would be more decent. They will be less corrupted. They will behave in a more human way, maybe at least toward the hostages' families. And so they will be very nice with the Americans. They will even negotiate with the PA. But by the end of the day, who is the alternative? The alternative in Israel, or the opposition in Israel, supports this war, supports the occupation, supports the apartheid. So what are we talking about? So when the alternative is so weak and not really an alternative, and Netanyahu has what Netanyahu has, you cannot undermine his capabilities. And yes, it might be. Don't forget that he has a whole operation. He increased his power in certain media outlets, which are quite influential, which he didn't have a few years ago. There are now more and more outlets which really serve him personally, even not the right-wingers, him personally, in a very efficient way. So the game is open in Israel, even if there will be elections. People thought until recently that elections mean the end of his career. Not sure anymore.
I mean, on that, there's a certain type of political tendency within Britain and elsewhere who are more focused on tone or vibes, if you like, than substance. So, for example, this is why you end up with a rehabilitation of George W. Bush, responsible for terrible, terrible crimes. But suddenly he's less vulgar than Trump. He doesn't do these vulgar, embarrassing tweets, for example. He may have laid waste to Iraq, Guantanamo, all is forgiven. Is there a bit of a similarity there, basically, which is Netanyahu, he's just too crude and vulgar, and actually you replace him with someone else who would just continue the same approach, but it would be he'd be less of an embarrassment almost. But I mean, there's no real divide within Israeli politics. The same policies would continue. The same view of collective punishment and collective guilt, for example, will continue.
Absolutely. I'm not sure that Netanyahu is vulgar. That's not his. I mean, Donald Trump is vulgar.
No, but corrupt. I know what you mean. Exactly. In his case, he's corrupt.
Yeah, but he is more sophisticated and more educated and more knowledgeable and more impressive, by the way.
He's a good performer. Yeah.
Absolutely. Much more than Donald Trump or George W. Bush. But by the end of the day, that's the biggest weakness of Israeli society today, that it has no alternative plan except of the plan of the right-wingers. And then it doesn't matter much who will be the prime minister when it comes to the core issues. And then also people say, okay, let it be Netanyahu. I mean, who else? They don't offer us anything. Give me one thing that people like Gantz, Lapid, even the Zionist left, what do they suggest which will look different? Did one of them call to stop the war? One of them? Is one of them ready for the two-state solution, but ready to go for it now? Is one of them even ready to bring the PA to Gaza? All kinds of ideas which I don't support. But at least it is a plan. Nothing. So therefore, we are facing not only Netanyahu, we are facing a society which will not be able to change in the coming future without a real change in its leadership. And this change is not foreseen right now, not foreseen by any direction, by any candidate.
The British government is about to be wiped out essentially in our parliamentary elections next Thursday. It's going to face a catastrophic landslide defeat. For pretty obvious reasons. It's had a ruinous 14 years in power. As a parting gift, it has intervened in the International Criminal Court's case, the chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, in order to claim that the ICC does not have jurisdiction in Palestine. I mean, I would imagine that I have no faith in the Labour government reversing that when they take power in a week's time. I mean, I'm just wondering just your general thoughts about what that represented. But within Israeli society, in any case, you know, there's that kind of, this is just a big conspiracy against Israel. That's the general just kind of gist, isn't it? But I'm interested in your thoughts about the British government intervening as well in order to protect Netanyahu, Gallant, and the Israeli state from claims of, obviously well-grounded, of crimes against humanity and war crimes.
I think the UK is only the first one, but not the last one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any Western European country, maybe Spain, I don't know, maybe Ireland. I don't see any one of them collaborating with the resolution of the ICC. But something must be said. It changed the atmosphere. Even if we are not expected to see neither Netanyahu nor Gantz being brought to justice in The Hague, I don't see it happening, but it changed something in the atmosphere. And you know, every time something is happening, people ask me, do you think this will make a change? No, nothing will make a change, and still it's incremental. I mean, more and more and more developments, more and more changes in the international atmosphere, in the international climate, which finally something will bring a change. But we are not there yet. So neither the ICJ nor the ICC will change the picture, not the recognition of 140 states in Palestine, including recently 2 more European countries. None of this will make the change, will be a game changer. But finally, the atmosphere is changing, and unfortunately, it is changing only outside and not inside Israel.
Lebanon. I wanted to talk about Lebanon. I mean, the statements from Yoav Gallant, aforementioned there, obviously there's an attempt by the chief prosecutor of the ICC to, have him arrested for crimes against humanity and war crimes. I guess the statements amount to, in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah, nice country you've got there, shame if something happened to it. Talk of, we don't want to, but we have the capability of sending Lebanon back to the Stone Age. I Googled that. It's a phrase he's used before repeatedly. In fact, before the 7th of October, Yoav Gallant has menacingly spoken about returning Lebanon to the Stone Age. I mean, that's implicitly a genocidal act, clearly. It certainly would involve a litany of war crimes. How serious do you think it is with Lebanon? Because actually, Hezbollah is not Hamas. And obviously, we've seen throughout Hezbollah, because, you know, and they justified based on Gaza. But I mean, they have the potential capacity to overwhelm Israel's air defenses. So it's just not the same thing at all. What do you think would happen? Do you think actually Israel doesn't actually want that confrontation for that reason, because it's nothing like Hamas? Or do you think it's inevitable at this point?
The key is in Gaza. And people tend to ignore it. Hezbollah, as usual, was very clear. Stop the war in Gaza and we will stop the war in Lebanon or in the Galilee. But Israel is not ready to stop the war in Gaza. And therefore, the fight must be over stopping the war in Gaza, which is a precondition for stopping the war in the north. Again, I can hardly understand my fellow Israelis. The dangers are really screaming from the walls. War with Hezbollah can be a real catastrophe, not only in the north, But in the place that I'm sitting now, in the center or in the north part of Tel Aviv, which is peaceful and life is as usual, almost as usual here, this will not continue if there will be a war with Hezbollah. And still there is this sense of apathy. Okay, no other choice. We have to fight also in Lebanon. We have nothing, there's no way to stop it. There's no solution. A war will be a solution. You ask people, okay, there will be a war. What do you think will be after this?
Mm-hmm.
What will be? You will gain exactly and achieve exactly what you achieved in Gaza. Namely, nothing. You will only lose. And here the sense of apathy, of fatalism, no other choice. We have to fight. We have to show them. We have to get some returns. I mean, all kind of really rubbish which are put in the mind of people here, and nobody stops for a moment and asks himself, just a second, it's our sons, it's our lives. Are we really ready? And the answer is yes.
But I wonder if, what your thoughts about this, there's actually a crisis there in that, as things stand, I mean, it's reported this week that in the first 6 months since 7th of October, over 500,000 Israelis left the country. And this is a population of 9.5 million. So that's a very substantial chunk of the population. And obviously the Israeli project is based on the idea of the so-called right to return. It's based on the idea this is a sanctuary for the Jewish people. You know, obviously it would be much safer to be in the United States, for example, or in a European country than Israel, just objectively. But actually, I mean, isn't that a potential danger that you end up, for example, if that's 500,000 since, you know, vis-a-vis Gaza, if you have that kind of armed confrontation with Hezbollah, just a lot of Israelis may just vote with their feet, even if they don't actually, even if they feel, and they might not change their political views. What do you think? I mean, could that actually unravel the Israeli project to a degree just by net migration becoming, you know, depleting the population?
No, but it will change the face of Israel. Because who leaves? Leaves anyone who, first of all, can live. Not everyone can live. This is quite a luxury to relocate. Not everyone can live. Not everyone can find his place in another place. Not everyone can find a job, and not everyone can get even the immigration papers in another place. It's not so easy. 500,000 left is a little bit a misleading figure, because you never know how many of them will come back after the war or not. So it is. I don't ignore, I don't underestimate this figure, but what strikes me much more is the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is of many, many people, mainly young people, asking, what do we do here? Are we really going to raise our children here? Do we want to stay here? What are the alternatives? You hear it everywhere. The zeitgeist right now of at least the young generation is, we have to find ourselves an alternative. Like never before, by the way. I'm old enough to remember in the 60s when the joke was that in the Ben Gurion airport there is a sign, please, the last one, please turn off the light.
Yeah.
We are not there. We are not there. Israel will not get empty from its Jewish citizens. It will just not happen. I mean, it might be a wishful thinking for some, but it will not happen. But Israel will and is already changing its face into something else, not what we knew, and for sure not what we wish to know. And those who will stay will be the religious, the Orthodox, the militants, the extremists, those who believe in the biblical right of Israel to be here, those who believe in living on a sword, and all the rest will gradually, not in one wave, it doesn't happen, those are processes, but those who believe in different life, in normal life, in realizing that there are two peoples here, not only one, Those will gradually leave, yes, or at least are planning to leave, which is bad enough. If you start to plan to leave, it shows that your commitment to this place gets weaker and weaker, and it will have many, many consequences.
Because you can see, I mean, Hungary is an example of a very reactionary regime, and a lot of the more progressively minded younger people have just left. And obviously that's emboldened the reactionary forces back home in Hungary. So you can see a similar process, the more progressively minded Israeli citizens leaving, and then the growth, the ever, I guess, ascendancy of the most extreme elements. I just want to end by talking about...
Sorry to interrupt you, nobody questions that if Hungary will exist in 100 years or 50 years.
Of course, yeah.
This question is being raised here. That's a big difference. Nobody raises the question if Hungary will exist in 100 years. Many ask now the questions, will Israel exist in 50 years? Well, and what kind of Israel? And what kind of Israel?
I mean, because before I was going to ask my last questions, that's a really good point. I do want to ask you about that as well, which is... Because actually, I mean, the way this could pan out is actually, you know, quite disturbing in huge amounts of ways. Because obviously, ideally, you want a land shared on the basis of equality and justice by all its citizens. That land belongs to all who live there. But you have now a kind of, you know, Israeli society bubbling over, and impunity has allowed that to happen. I mean, this is a case study of what happens when you have a society which is overwhelmed by, you know, sentiments which are often pretty genocidal, I would say, but there's nothing to keep it in check. It's armed and backed by a superpower. So there's nothing really to keep that in check. It doesn't look sustainable, I have to say. I don't think this sort of mentality is indefinitely sustainable, not least because public opinion in the West is changing anyway. Not least in the United States, not least, I would say, amongst the generation of younger Jewish Americans who are playing a very leading role in the pro-Palestine movement in the United States. So, I mean, I'm just interested in that. Is there no, you know, could it kick in eventually a kind of, this isn't sustainable, and actually, you know, this could end up with the catastrophic collapse of the Israeli project? A lot, I mean, even things like factors like Egypt, it's just taken as read that Egypt will be indefinitely run by what is actually at the moment an extremely unpleasant dictatorship, which is backed and armed by the West itself, which is pliant. But things can change. That's the point. I don't know. What do you think? Is there a sense of, you know, at least creeping insecurity that, you know, some will say, well, actually, that's why we have to behave like this. That's why we're going to be violently expansionist. But is there not saner voices which might think, well, that's not sustainable, and this could end up with a long-term catastrophe?
So that's exactly the division line in Israeli society right now. Those who think that it's not sustainable for a long time, and those who think that because it is so dangerous, we should do whatever we are doing now. That it is an existential war, for example. So you have the two sides of the same coin. The conclusions are opposite. Those who say it's not sustainable, and therefore let's start to consider going somewhere else. And those who say this is not sustainable, so therefore let's become really crazy and do anything possible to save this country by force, by power, by violating any international laws, by mass killings, by genocide, by anything, because we are living on our existence. And that's a very interesting point, because both parties see the picture the same. They only draw different conclusions out of it. The problem is that we should remember that those things take decades. Those are processes. And we always try to see what will be. I mean, after the war, will Israel stop to exist in 10 years? Will Israel turn? No, it is long processes which are already happening. It's not like Israel today is really in turmoil, and things are bubbling within the Israeli society much more than we can even admit it. But the question is, how will it end? And if there will be no alternative leadership, which I don't see, if there will be no reset or restart for the Zionistic project, then sooner or later, this will be over and something else. I don't say Israel will stop to exist. I don't share this view because Israel is still by far stronger, richer, and more supported by the West than any other country in the Middle East. And this will not change so quickly. We know how the United States is changing its policies very, very slowly. It will take decades. But meanwhile, Israel is changing itself from within. It's becoming, obviously, for people like me, a less and less place that you would like to live in, or for sure to raise your children or grandchildren. And you hear you hear it not from dissidents like me, you hear it from mainstream Israelis, young Israelis. We don't see our future here. We don't want our children to grow into this. You see now soldiers which are removed after 9 months in Gaza, they remove them now to Lebanon. Did you achieve something in Gaza? No. Will you achieve something in Lebanon? No. But we go. You know, in a certain stage, this will break because people are, I mean, even I'm shocked that it didn't happen yet. But I know that those things take time. We are not aiming at a good direction. I can tell you only one thing. I cannot think about a promising scenario, about an optimistic scenario for Israel. I cannot see it. With whom? With whom exactly? With whom will come the change? Only with a massive intervention of the international community, which I don't see happening as well.
Well, just finally, I actually want to ask about you, if you don't mind me doing so, because I've always been interested, throughout history, individuals who speak out when it's extremely difficult to do so, who swim against the current. And I know you reported, you said someone came up to you and called you a traitor. I think this was a little while ago. But I'm just interested in just the atmosphere for someone like yourself speaking out within the context of Israeli society. Often progressives like myself living in Britain, where we've had, we have our political problems and difficulties, and the United States even worse, which is often hope lies with the young, for example. Younger people are far more progressive. In other Western countries, that's not true. That's not true in Italy, for example. In Brazil, Bolsonaro's strongest support came from millennial men. So it's not it's not a universal rule. Israeli society, younger people are more militaristic and more reactionary than their older generations. I've seen footage of teachers basically nearly getting lynched by their pupils because they've spoken out in support of peace or something mild. In terms of you, what kind of pressure are you under? Do you fear violence, for example? Do you fear the threat of does your security worry you when you speak out in these ways?
Not until now. 2014 was much more violent, and I don't have the explanation except of maybe the explanation either that I got older or that the social media is replacing the violence, and the violence is there and not in the streets. But except of this, I don't have an explanation. You might feel very secure and you are in danger, and you might be very in danger and feel secure. It's not always expected. The same thing, by the way, with I continue to travel every week to the West Bank. This is also not very secure on the other hand. Last week I was at the Jenin refugee camp, and armed people directed their guns toward me when they heard that I'm Jewish. They were in such a shock that a Jew dared to enter the camp that it took them some time before they shot until they realized that it's not the Jew they know. But in any case, I still feel free and safe, I must tell you. It was not always very pleasant, but I still feel really free and safe. It's not only about safety, it's also about the possibility to express your views. And in both cases, being a Jew in a real liberal democracy for the Jews, which has many cracks now, many cracks, I know for sure that this should not be taken for granted. And you see the changes even in this. I'm not sure that I will give you the same answer in half a year.
But I can tell you don't, yeah, because that's the other point which you alluded to, that the self-censor, you know, do we sometimes not say what we think because we fear the consequences? It sounds like you'd never come across like someone who self-censors.
No, but we are reaching it. We are reaching it.
Just funny in terms of what gives, because I know looking for hope in the current context is difficult, but the reason I'm just interested what you think about this. The left, as I understand the left, as I was raised in the left would not exist without the contribution of progressive Jews throughout history. One of the reasons anti-Semites would often target Jews, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, was because of the disproportionate Jewish contribution to movements of liberation, of emancipation. And that strikes me, that's because you had a Jewish diaspora in many different countries who understood the danger of nationalism, because when countries became more nationalistic, it was often Jewish people who ended up being the targets. They were seen as interlopers, aliens, disloyal to the nation they existed. A good example was France during the Dreyfus affair, for example. But that was always a recurring theme in Russia, in the Tsarist Russia, and so on. And it strikes me that what Israel tried to do is teach. The conclusion was, we have to be nationalistic like them. We need our own nationalism to defend ourselves. But the consequences are very similar, obviously, for minorities, just as it was for Jewish people in those different countries. But I mean, that international lives on. You can see it in Britain. You can see it in, the United States. 39% of young Jews in America think that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. If I was an Israeli leader, I'd be worried about those figures if you get a generation of younger Jewish Americans. So I just think, what do you think? That tradition lives on, and actually it lives on in the United States of all places, and that could be how this ends, because they will build power and pressure within the United States, not just Jewish Americans, other Americans, of course, as well, but they're saying this isn't in our name. What do you think? Is that Jewish tradition is being reborn elsewhere, and that will help end this nightmare?
So, first of all, we were brought up in a very nationalistic state without knowing that we are brought up in a very nationalistic and militaristic state, by the way. The first years maybe were even worse than now. The only difference was that we were totally unaware. We were brought up into this. We were born into this. If I look now in my childhood, I mean, this was in many ways North Korea. Without feeling in North Korea, not in terms of freedom, by the way, no, but in terms of recruiting the young generation for a collective national goal or goals. This was unbelievable. When I look at my childhood, I can't believe how were we brought up in this atmosphere, feeling that we are a small island in an ocean of enemies, and everything we were told about our David being David against Goliath, and so many other things. But it was made in a different way, and it was covered up much better than now. Now, yes, Israel is turning into nationalism like never before, in the more aggressive and brutal nationalism, because nationalism must not necessarily become so aggressive and violent, and must not necessarily be so blind to the other people surround you. You might think that you are the best one, you might think you are the chosen people, and still leave some room for the others. Israel does not leave any room for the others. This is one aspect. The other aspect is what you have asked about the Jewish community in the world. But don't forget that young Israelis are quite disconnected from the Jewish world, Jewish communities outside. It's quite artificial, this connection. What do you think a soldier in Gaza now feels or has in common with a Jewish student in Colombia? Even if he's Jewish, so what? I mean, there is not so much in common, much less than okay, we are celebrating the same holiday. They are Americans, we are Israelis, with all the meanings of it. And most of us are also secular, so what do I have in common with them? What should be in mind and is not in mind is that those demonstrators in Harvard and in Columbia are the next Pentagon and the next State Department and the next presidents of the United States. They will all come from this generation. The only problem is you are smiling because younger than me. You have the time to wait for it, and I don't.
I was crossing my fingers. I was crossing my fingers.
Exactly. I'm crossing my fingers as well. But I will not see it, and you will foresee. You will witness it. I will not witness it because it will take time, a lot of time. And here you have a very optimistic ending. Cannot be better than this.
I know, and do you know what? It's not always the way we do these interviews. Often we end often in the most despairing moment. So this is a first. This is a world exclusive. We have a positive ending from Gideon Levy. Thank you very much. Seriously, Gideon, it's always such a pleasure. So much insight. You are, I know you say your security, you don't worry about it, but you are an extremely courageous voice, and moral, the pressure that you face within Israeli society just by virtue of being such an isolated voice is obviously immense.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you.
But I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe, everyone. Do share this video. But Gideon, thank you so much as ever for your wisdom.
Thank you very much.